This is the Rate of Rise series brought to you by Roast Magaine. Today we're talking with Meister about coffee packaging. Well, hey everybody, this is Chris DeFurio with Keys to the Shop. Welcome to another episode of the Rate of Rise series, which is where we have elevated conversations on roasting. And this is brought to you by Roast Magaine. And Roast Magaine is one of the longest running and most respected trade journals in the coffee industry. If you are a roaster or you're thinking about roasting and you want to keep up with the latest research, knowledge, and insights from scientists, subject matter experts, and professionals from across the industry, then you have to subscribe to Roast Magaine. Roast has published several books and provides incredible resources for the roasting community, including their series of audio articles presenting articles from their archives covering coffee from a technical perspective. So go over to roastmagaine.com and subscribe today. Okay, everybody. So today we are going to be talking about packaging, and this is based on the article by Meister back in the September-October edition of Roast Magaine called The Perfect Package. And we're going to be covering a lot of ground today about the topic of coffee packaging, which is a surprisingly compelling topic. Now, Meister has worked in the coffee industry for over 20 years in a wide range of capacities. Now, primarily, she is a journalist, educator, communicator, whose work focuses on issues of access, equity, and ethics. She is the author of New York City Coffee, A Caffeinated History, and the host of the coffee marketing podcast In Good Taste on the Sprudge Media Network. I am always happy to have a conversation with because she brings an incredible depth of insight to basically any topic that she's thinking about in the coffee industry. And this subject is no exception. As we talk about packaging, we explore the topic that in all of the areas of the business that it touches. We're talking about the evolution of packaging in the industry over the years, the main considerations that roasters need to factor in when making decisions about the kind of packaging they're using in their roasteries, what it communicates to consumers, what kind of impact does it have on the industry overall, what about the quality of the coffee in the bag. And then there's the relationships that we have to factor in, like the relationships between you and your vendor, also the practical use of these products by your baristas, and of course your customers. And there's much more in this conversation. So I hope that you enjoyed this talk with Meister all about coffee packaging. Well, welcome back to Keys to the Shop. Pleasure to talk to you as always. How are you?
I'm doing great, Chris. Thanks for having me. How are you doing?
I'm doing fantastic. As I was preparing for this interview, I was just thinking of all of the angsty thoughts I've had about packaging and specialty coffee over the course of the last couple of years. And then I was like, I really have to start, I have to put some questions in here to talk about, where we are in terms of packaging in the industry, because I feel like it's changed a lot. And at first glance, the subject of packaging doesn't seem like the world's most scintillating topic. Although we do buy based on labels like wine, a lot of us. So I think this is going to actually be a pretty interesting discussion. And the article was fantastic. So we're going to get a little bit deeper here, just I guess by starting by talking about packaging's evolution. Because way back in the day, I'm remembering, like I wasn't around in the early 90s for coffee, but packaging was pretty minimal. Mm-hmm. And I'm just kind of curious from your perspective, what kind of phases have you seen or know packaging has gone through over the years in specialty coffee in particular?
I think it's been a really interesting evolution. And I think to a certain extent, we've gone a little bit forward and a little bit backward. In the earlier days of my career, I remember there being kind of a combination of, certainly in a cafe environment, you had the big 5-pound bags that we used for service, and then we would measure out smaller amounts of coffee for customers in craft bags. Mm-hmm. For a long time, it seemed like craft bags were kind of the standard, except when you were buying, more grocery store packaged coffees or coffees that were specifically packaged for retail, which tended to be more like what we see today. The design has certainly changed. Now you see a lot more of those flat bottom bags and bags that are designed to stand straight up on a shelf. We certainly saw, I think in the like I would say the 2010s, there was like a brief resurgence of cans. People started to
Yes.
use some coffee cans, and I loved that. I thought that was so great. And there are still a few companies that really predominantly use cans, but that it didn't really catch on. But I'm sure that you and I have both witnessed sort of the evolution of the one-way valve, and whether or not you had a tin tie sort of top. Now there's a lot of the zipper top bags. And it seems like those are the kinds of things that have changed the most. Not so much the materials themselves, actually.
Yeah, it's the packaging itself. It seems like a signal of a philosophy that people have toward coffee. And then there's the utilitarian stuff like the one-way valve and the functionality of the bag. But for a lot of people, it's like when you're looking at packaging, you're trying to figure out what it is that it communicates about you and your brand. And I feel like we park on the aesthetics so much, which, when you're talking about craft bags, I remember it was just also like craft bags, stamps. The stamps weren't even. They were just like anywhere on the bag is fine. Who cares?
That side work of stamping all the bags.
Yes. It was just like, devil may care attitude, I guess, about that stuff. And it was kind of cool. It was kind of fun. And now, of course, we've got like Russian nesting dolls for packaging.
Yeah.
Yes, I don't even know when we're going to get to the coffee, but the journey is part of the fun. The thing that people come into this conversation with is, I think, lots of different levels of concerns, maybe starting with the aesthetic. But as you were writing this, and just from your own observations in the industry, what do you think are the most common concerns that roasters have when they're approaching the prospect of their packaging of their roasted coffee?
It's a really complicated decision. It's funny, as I was sort of preparing for this and as I was researching this story, I thought it's just amazing to sort of think about how difficult every step of this whole thing is. And something that seems as simple to a consumer as what bag the coffee is in is this amazing combination of equations and thought exercises that a roaster has to do in order to find just the right thing. And it's, a combination of a bag that will literally hold coffee, that will hold the right amount of coffee, that will prevent that coffee from being exposed to moisture, light, and oxygen. Then, how many of this bag do I need to order? How am I going to customize it for individual coffees? Do I print directly on the bag? Do I add a sticker? How much additional labor does it create in my warehouse to have one type over another type? For instance, a lot of those tin type bags, you have to actually manually attach the little tin tie, whereas, in the others, they just become sealed in a factory. And just considering all of the different labor, all of the space that these things take up and the expense. And then, on top of the rest of it, an increasing concern of how environmentally sound are these different bags. How aesthetically pleasing are they? How do they feel? All these different things. It's such a complex network of questions and answers that a roaster has to go through. It's kind of astounding.
That is a lot of questions, yes. And something makes me think that not all of those questions are asked when we make decisions about packaging.
That's probably true.
Yeah. I mean, there are things that we should consider, if you're deciding whether or not you're going to manually apply a tin tie. I get the feeling sometimes that somebody would buy a bag because it's just like, this is a really good bag. I'm going to go for this. But then they realize it actually at scale amounts to a greater degree of labor. Had they asked that question in the beginning, perhaps they would have gone in with a built-in option like the zipper bag or something like that. How do we start the process of thinking through the implications of our decisions? And do we start with this, what impacts the quality of the coffee first is, bag attributes, or do we start with the implication for cost and labor and those things, or is it just kind of all of that?
That is the first of many existential questions that arise when thinking about something that seems so mundane. I think like anything in coffee, the best way to approach it is to make a list of priorities from the beginning. What is important to me? And I think a lot of people will say coffee quality above all. But when we think about coffee quality, there's a lot of different ways to kind of quantify that. Is it freshness? Is it relationship? Is it integrity? Like what defines quality? So I think when you're looking for a package, it's a similar process of going, am I more interested in preserving freshness? Or am I more interested in having a kind of billboard for my brand? Is there something that makes me particularly appealing to a certain vendor that I want to partner with? Or is it environmental sustainability and those types of concerns? And then, because everything in this industry and everything in life is a bit of a compromise, you kind of make a web or a map to say, these are the areas that I'm willing to compromise in order to, reach my goals or meet my goals in these other areas. And then I think you just talk to as many people as possible. I think a lot of folks, especially after you spend all this time like picking out a roaster and picking out coffees and, building out your space and hiring people, it's like decision fatigue of all time. So to then have to think about, oh God, like how many bag manufacturers do I have to talk to and sit through the whole spiel? But it's actually really important to build a strong relationship and to like really feel like you're getting what you want. And, I remember being a young, totally naive barista who had no idea about what it meant to run a coffee business at all, and going to trade shows and feeling like, what are all of these non-coffee companies doing at this show? Looking at the bag manufacturers and just feeling so bored by that sort of thing. Like their booths are, boring and functional.
Yeah.
And now it's like, that is so important to go and meet those people and to ask them about their products and to see the whole range laid out, and it's just so funny how completely ignorant I was to the significance of that kind of a decision and how complicated it is to do when you're not all in the same building looking at the products themselves, physically in your hands. I do think that it's important to build a relationship with that vendor as much as you would with anyone else, because it is the thing your coffee is going into. The coffee itself being your product and your showcase and your prized feature, what you work on and what you put your passion into. The fact that it goes into a container that is the way that you advertise that to the average consumer makes it a much more significant purchase or a significant investment than a lot of the other things that I think we waste some time on. So I would start there. I would start with making that list, and then I would do as much reading and meeting people and reaching out as possible, and ask other coffee roasters, what do you think about your bags, and what questions did you ask yourself? And, I think we're lucky to work in a relatively open source industry where I think people are willing to talk about that stuff.
Yeah, you're right. And I love the idea of mapping out those priorities and determining which ones are the most important and non-negotiables for you. That would probably be extremely helpful given, in today's economy with supply chain issues. You're going to have some constraints on what people are able to give you. You might have the ideal, this gilded image of what a coffee bag at your roastery will look like, but they're going to tell you, well, we don't have, or we can't do, and maybe if you tried, and so forth, right? So I guess you would have like a plan B and a plan C for maybe it's not as, pleasing, but it still ticks some of those boxes. The answers that you get to those questions, being that we're an open industry, I think it's easy for people to ask those questions and then accept the answer. Well, we didn't really like this. Like, we don't really like those zip tie box bottom bags. And then not follow it up. It might be a mistake to not follow that up and say, exactly why didn't you like that? Because somebody's reason for not liking it may not be really line up with your priorities. So instead of taking it at face value, maybe just being more curious, right?
Yeah, it's that age-old coffee distinction between quality and preference.
Right. Quality, as you were talking about it, there are things that are, I think, maybe scientifically, or maybe they're always debated as to whether or not they're going to be, it sounds science, but things like the one-way valves. I remember just coffee bars back, like we were talking about with craft bags, refuse that. It's like, that's bull crap. We're not going to do that. It's just like free and open. It's like the Puerto Rico Coffee Company in New York City, just open containers of coffee. So there's this balance between perceived quality and actual quality preservation. And I guess if we're going to, it might be too much to talk about like perceived quality of colors and textures and things like that. But when it comes to making practical decisions of things that actually do affect and impact the quality, objectively affect the quality of the coffee in the bag, what kind of things should we consider that are a little bit more easy to show? Yeah, that's going to be a given right there.
They're still very difficult to measure, but I do think the ability that a material has to block light, to block moisture, and to block oxygen are the key things. Those are the key elements that cause coffee to stale, or the oils to turn slightly rancid, or to compromise the quality in those specific ways that we would understand as being objective quality that's quote unquote irrefutable. And the coffee bag manufacturers should have some tangible way of proving like a lower oxygen transmission rate for certain materials, or a moisture vapor transmission rate for certain materials. And then it's a matter of finding the intersection between cost and the effectiveness of those materials in combination with each other. There is certainly a degree of perceived quality from the consumer's end based on the way that the bag feels and the way that the bag is designed with those things in mind. I think, seeing a bag today that doesn't have a one-way valve, I don't know. I don't actually scientifically know, and I can't remember. I know I've talked to folks about this, but I don't actually scientifically know if it makes that much of a difference. But in my mind, it's a must-have. And there's a degree of resealability that is really important for me. I want to be able to actually close the bag again, make sure I compress the air out and can close it again. So for me, when I see those bags that you cut the top open and then they come with a little sticker that says resealable tape, for me, I always, when I open a box or something and I have a bag like that, I go, oh, come on.
Got to break out the chip clips.
Yeah, honestly, I may as well just pour this in a bowl and have it out like in a candy dish. It just seems so ineffective to me, but I don't know if it's effective or not. It's just a notion that I have. But I also think, I don't know, in general, I think coffee professionals obsess more about quality in this way than the average coffee consumer does. I don't know that the average coffee consumer gives two hoots about, whether or not the bag is resealable, except that it is neater. I don't know if they think that must mean that this is better quality.
And for all we know, they may give 0, they may give 5 hoots, who knows?
Somewhere between 0 and 5 hoots.
On the hoot scale, the SCA is the research team needs to get on this. So the perceived quality, and I was just going to mention resealability too, like that. What the customer does with the coffee ultimately is pretty much how you would want to judge the aesthetic and the use, the customer experience with that bag. Going through the process of opening it, pouring coffee, and closing it. I wonder how many people, when they make these decisions, actually take the bag sample, fill it up, and then bring it home to like use it themselves before making a decision. And maybe how many frustrating kitchen counter moments might be avoided if that practice was more common. Who knows? Or
cafe counter experiences. I mean, working behind the bar and weighing out doses or weighing out coffees to brew in bulk. I can personally say that when I get a coffee bag that has one of those little resealable, like a fancy Ziploc, I always think, God, this is going to be so annoying to pour coffee out of because it's so hard to keep the bag open with 2 hands while you're trying to, make sure you don't knock over the tin or whatever, there are just things that I have come to realize that working in a coffee shop, certain types of packaging are much less convenient than others. And there may be some compromise on, but this one's not as resealable or the other one. But it is funny that as you say that, that's exactly what I was thinking. I just last week, I was like, oh God, I wish that this didn't have one of those zippers. Yeah. I wish I could just cut the top off and pour.
You gotta like open it like you're squeezing a face and make it smile. You gotta pinch it and then pinch and pour. So you got to consider those things, I guess, for your professionals also who have to grind coffee for customers. Going through the life cycle of that bag, as you talked about mapping out the priorities, but then saying, well, if we make this decision, what does the bag's use look like in the contexts we know it's going to live in? That too, I guess, is something you could map out. And it seems like a lot of work, again, like you were talking about decision fatigue. So actually, all of a sudden, I'm thinking about how tedious it kind of sounds. I guess it wouldn't be tedious if you were giving yourself enough time to make these decisions. I mean, if you're counseling somebody who is opening a roastery or maybe just thinking about changing their packaging over during a rebrand, how much time should we give ourselves to actually go from concept to launch with all these factors in place?
Great question. I think it will vary based on your need. For some folks, it's like one of the last pieces that they're putting together before they open. And so, again, by that point, your decision fatigue is pretty extreme. So I would say, start the process as early as possible so that you're not sort of choosing the cheapest rather than what's the best option. I mean, when I talked to Jesse from Ruby Roasters, he said it from start to finish, it probably took them 2 years to both land on just the right packaging, to work with the vendor, to get their design nailed down, to make sure that the level of compostability that they wanted was available, things like that. I don't think that the average person has 2 years to think about packaging, but the funny thing about the tedium of a decision like this, when you set aside the time to do it and to go through all these different exercises, first of all, if it wasn't tedious, everyone could do it. Anyone could just start a coffee roastery. There's a reason that there are certain people who go through the steps. And then the other thing is, it's only tedious once. If you make the right decision one time and you take the time to prepare it, then you're not 3 months later going, oh crap, these bags didn't work out. I have to find something new. Or what am I going to do with the rest of them? How am I going to run through this minimum order that I have? Like with anything, I think if you do the work in the beginning, it might not be the most glamorous. Like most of operating a coffee business is not especially glamorous. Right. So, I would say the actual amount of time it will take will vary, but I think that the investment of the time is so important. Even just writing this article, I wasn't making a specific decision for my business, and I still was absolutely dumbfounded by what I was hearing and learning. It really influenced the way that I think about how these behind the scenes things get taken care of and how important they are.
What was one of the things that you're especially dumbfounded by?
The sheer unsustainability of coffee packaging, even today in the year 2022. When we've been talking about climate change within and outside of the industry for decades, there still are so few even remotely sustainable options. It is absolutely mind-blowing. And I don't know where in the intersection of a lack of the technology and a lack of the market for it or the scalability of it, like I don't know where the holdup is or the bottleneck is in developing this sort of thing. I found exactly one company that claims to have a fully compostable coffee bag. And this company is very small and almost no one uses them. And all the other packages that I see that say compostable on them are almost not compostable. And if you don't compost them, it's as good as throwing them in a landfill. So all of this greenwashing around packaging that has happened, that we have kind of perpetuated and allowed to happen, is astounding to me in an industry that also, out of the other side of its mouth, claims to be concerned about climate change, sustainability, all these terms that we just use all over the place. The thing we sell our coffee in is contributing to this massive buildup of waste. It's really unbelievable.
It is kind of shocking, and I'm not going to say that I have not thoroughly enjoyed having some coffee boxes and, bags and boxes and boxes and bag type of situations where it arguably could be excessive, but I'm like, whoa, this is really nice. I like this on my counter. And so the argument, I imagine, is the additional sales and perception of quality increases the price, and the price, therefore, going up will, counteract whatever non-sustainable packaging impact. So there's this give and take of we're going to sell more because of the perceived value of this substantial amount of packaging that we're using, but that's going to, I don't know, it feels like, robbing Peter to pay Paul type of thing. But that's the conundrum, right? Like, what lever do I pull? Do I increase the perceived value to increase the price to pay farmers more? Is that just a false dichotomy that I'm making? Help us, Ever. What?
Oh, gosh. I don't know if I can. And in part because I think the amount of options that exist are so limited. Right now, it seems to me like the vast majority of roasters have their hands tied when it comes to finding packaging that meets all of these sort of sustainability goals. They're just technically are not the options. The one option that does exist, which is, like we were talking about before, sort of rare these days, are cans, which are fully recyclable. But the problem with cans is, how do you mail them across the country if you do e-commerce? Where do you find the storage for them in your warehouse? What do you do with all these empty cans that are taking up all this space where bags can fold and lay flat in a box somewhere in a corner? You almost need a separate warehouse just for cans, when you have a bigger operation. So there aren't really perfect solutions, but I do think that we need to put a little bit more pressure on manufacturers to innovate and to really seek ways to solve this problem. There has to be a way to solve the problem. How long ago did we put a man on the moon? We can't figure out how to make compostable coffee bags. And if at a certain point that means that we sacrifice 2 weeks of shelf life, it seems to me like 2 weeks of shelf life versus 50 years in a landfill is a pretty easy equation. Like, are we so obsessed with quality and our egos that we're willing to continue to dump stuff that does nothing but harm to the planet so that someone can bring home a bag of coffee that has like the fountain of youth injected into the bag? That seems so silly to me. I feel like our priorities are a little bit mixed up.
Sure. Well, the older I get, the more I'm attracted to that fountain of youth coffee you just mentioned. But I think when you're talking about pressure on people that are producing these bags, they're reading the market and seeing the purchase of all these bags, and decision that you make in the beginning for what you're going to use, especially if you're a new company and you can't predict the future, that you're going to be so huge and have so much influence, but 10 years from now you may. And the decisions that you make right now would have long-lasting implications for how the market is driven to innovate something. The same kind is true of the packaging that we had in the olden days, the non-valve, the craft bags. It was the culture and attitude of specialty coffee that overcame the design sins of coffee packaging, because there was beautiful wine bottles and beautiful beer and everything else. Coffee was just kind of throwing it in bags, and it was cool to do it because coffee was, I would argue, viscerally more cool then because it was newer. And so it's sort of proven that you don't need this kind of level of ornate design or waste in order to, affect the quality perception of a coffee. But so maybe we're just so far away from the guardrail because we're scared of getting even close to it. But like you said, like 50 years in a landfill versus, the shelf life, like we can calibrate for that and change the way we serve coffee to compensate, but you can't do the reverse.
Right. I mean, I think we a little bit as an industry are guilty of digging our own holes. We have for, the last 15, 20 years, really pushed a certain type of consumer into believing that a certain type of product based on external factors and language and, the way that they interact with the marketing and the branding, that is what quality is. And I think it's really hard to backtrack from that. I think it's really hard to say, let's really simplify, or let's stop using some of these words that are misleading, because now they're touchstones for people. We've grown up as an industry, and for better or worse, these things have grown up alongside us. And so, I think it would take a lot of work. And I think, like everything else, any progress is going to require collective action. I think it takes, multiple people and multiple companies saying, we are going to make this change for this reason. And these are our priorities. And we hope that you'll come along with us on this journey. And I think we need to trust that folks will.
That's interesting, because the reason why they accept that there's this one way to perceive quality is because we've told them that.
Mm-hmm.
And the way that you fix it is to tell them something else, or at least to, like you say, communicate to them, here's the reasons. A while ago when we did a sustainability series, that was sort of the thought for consumers on the consumer episode, which was there's this mimetic effect that happens along the lines of, not tugging on people's heartstrings necessarily. Well, it is actually tugging on people's heartstrings by saying, well, here are the long-term impacts. You don't want to guilt people too much, because this is supposed to be a pleasurable experience. Back to what we were talking about. You want the customer experience with the bag to be, not frustrating. It still has to be functional, but they ought to feel good about what they're doing. So we do have the opportunity to sort of communicate through our decisions and communicate about our decisions too.
Yeah, I think we tend to feel afraid to do that. I think we tend, as a species, I think we tend to be afraid to change our minds and to very openly sort of say, we may have been wrong about that, and we're going to pivot. But I think that consumers are looking to trust us. I think consumers in general, speaking of myself as a consumer of other things, we always talk about consumers like they're different. Somehow they're an alien species landed on Earth and said, bring me to your coffee roasters. As a consumer, I am always looking to put my trust in the people who make the thing I'm trying to buy. And so they drive the things that I'm supposed to care about through marketing, for better or worse. It's just the way that marketing exists, and it's the way that the economic system and social systems that we live in exist. And so, you think about coffee and how specialty coffee existed for how many years before bulletproof coffee came around, right? And suddenly there was this whole wave of people talking about these certain things that you had to do to coffee in order to make it healthy. Same thing with the mycotoxins, right? People are talking about, there is a huge number of people who are really concerned with this thing that no one had heard about 10 years ago, because they read an article or they saw a brand that was advertising itself as being clean. Or, think about everyone who says they like cold brew because it's lower acid.
Yes.
There are millions of people who are drinking cold brew because they think it's lower acid on a pH scale. So it's not impossible to shift consumer thinking. Clearly somebody's doing it. So I think, we have a couple of opportunities as an industry, as a responsibility, to really push for innovation and to push for people to change their priorities in order to create a world that will continue for the next, 60 to 70 years. I certainly don't want the world to end before the last coffee bag decomposes in a landfill. I would much rather my coffee get a little stale.
We're talking about the end of the world, and we're talking about changing the world, and people who are in small roasteries, especially, and just getting into it, I think there's this ecosystem that's so localized And
Mm-hmm.
it's hard to imagine that anything I do is really going to have any kind of an impact outside of my area. Back to the market being driven by decisions of many individuals, these
Mm-hmm.
bag manufacturers serve tons of people exactly like you. And the questions that you ask and the desires that you have for packaging, they're noted in these companies. So you can affect change that way, even though you're small. And I think it's like a feeling of overwhelm, back again to the idea of overwhelm. Like, we have to think through all of these things. We've got to consider the long-term implications. But a lot of us who start in coffee really do want to make a difference. And it's kind of funny that you could make a difference just by the kind of decisions you make about coffee bag.
That's true of any decision we make in the industry. It's true of where you place your business and who you hire and what you pay them. I think we do live in this world where the pressures to do good and the pressures to make change seem so outsized, right? Like, we're confronted with this idea of, if you use a plastic straw, you are causing the extinction of turtles. It feels so overwhelming. But we do make plenty of decisions in our daily lives that have ripple effects, even just in the relationships that we have, in our personal relationships. And then when you own a business or you start a brand, you have a specific responsibility to consider those impacts in a different way. And I mean, I just think that is an opportunity to, not to change us hurtling toward some kind of comet, but certainly to do our part to try. There's no harm in trying.
And at a very basic level, these decisions are going to either contribute to the success or not success of your own business, which other people rely on, your staff and your consumers and their perception of specialty coffee based on the marketing that you do and the quality of your product. It's all inputs going all around in these communities. So en masse, it creates the reality of where we're going to be 10 years from now. So thinking through these things is so critical, especially that you accept your power, accept your position of authority. This is why you can convince people about the mycotoxins and all these other things and cause a frenzy, because everyone's so hypersensitive. And also, we glorify people that have a perceived authority based on their platform. So you have a coffee shop, you're a roaster, boom. I pretty much trust everything you say because I don't have one. And so who am I going to listen to? Me? Probably not. and that's kind of scary. Like, okay, but we're learning too.
Right.
Which is why you have to give yourself all this time to make the right decisions. Geez, getting deep here.
I know.
Yeah.
Every conversation with me turns to this at some point. We'll end up talking about the end of the world.
At least one more time before we get off of the phone here. But so I wanted to go back and kind of talk about some practicalities of our decisions along the way, because we do have all these options. And one of the things that we see happening in the industry, there's a lot of people choosing different packaging just to stand out. People put things in glass bottles. There are still people putting it in cans. It's the size of the bag that's changing a lot. And it's a rare coffee shop that sells a full 1 pound of coffee, even a half pound of coffee. It's always like 12-ounce bags. And I think some people are even going to 10-ounce bags. What's behind the shift in packaging sizes? Is it a calculated decision based on economics or availability of options? What's going on there?
That's a great question. I think it's probably a combination. It makes sense to have a few types of standard size of bags, in part because of the complexity and the cost of the materials. You don't want to be the company that has a press that makes 7-ounce bags if no one's ordering them. It's a waste of time. So there are standardized sizes that I think people have become used to. I think that the shift downward from the full pound bag to the 12-ounce bag, which has probably happened in the last 20 years, is a matter of it being a small enough drop that the consumer doesn't feel especially ripped off while still being able to charge the same or almost the same amount of money. I think a lot of that has to do with rising cost of doing business, cost of materials rising. Also, the fact that when you buy a sack of coffee, say it has 152 pounds of green coffee in it, that doesn't equate to 152 pounds of roasted coffee. You and I know there's shrinkage involved. And so you can get more individual product out of a full sack of coffee if you sell slightly less of the roasted coffee, without necessarily having to even open another sack of green coffee. So that is a practical reason, I think, too.
I think when we're talking about this packaging shift, there's been a lot of talk about, it's just kind of nefarious reasons. We're really just trying to squeeze the consumer. And in some ways, I guess, based on what you're saying and what I've heard also elsewhere, is like kind of yes, in a way. Not trying to fool them necessarily, like, haha, we got away with something, but almost like we need to survive. And, coffee is too cheap as it is. And we need to make sure that, we're going to be able to be profitable, and, things are more expensive generally. But at the same time, I think customers, when they get a bag of coffee, sometimes their perception, maybe it's an age or generational thing, is that it's a pound of coffee. Just that's an easy way to remember things. Just, that's a pound of coffee. Grab a pound of coffee. It's 12 ounces. Don't even look at it. And some people I've heard actually like, I thought this was a full pound. It's 12 ounces. It's interesting. And then they automatically insert some, again, nefarious reason for why that is. There is a need for us to be responsible with what customers' perceptions are about those changes that we make. And I'm curious, do you think that we've been doing a good job meeting the customer where they are with the kind of decisions we have been making with the way we display coffee and make changes to sizes and other things that impact the way that they use those bags in that coffee?
That's an interesting question. First, I do want to say, I don't think that there's nefariousness afoot.
Right.
It's the same thing like when you buy an automatic coffee maker and it describes you measuring coffee in cups, but the coffee cups that it means is 5 ounces, even though you know that a standard cup is 8 ounces.
Yes.
I don't think that it's necessarily maliciousness as much as, I don't know what, a human tendency to make things much more complicated than they need to be, perhaps. But yeah, are we doing a good job in meeting the customer where they are and what they need? I think our mileage may vary there. Being customer facing again for the first time in a long time, after having worked in wholesale and worked in retail, and worked in, green coffee sales. So like 2 levels removed from the customer. I have to say that in my anecdotal personal experience, I don't know if we are meeting the customer where they are. I think we're trying to meet an idealized version of our customer where they are, but I don't think that the majority of our actual customers are there.
What do you mean by like not meeting them there? Like specifically, is it the information on the bag? Is it the size of the bag, or is it just the actual coffee in the bag?
I think it's a little bit of all of the above. The size of the bag, I don't think matters so much. I think it seems fine to me that coffee is suddenly in 12-ounce bags, and that super special coffees often come in smaller bags. I don't think that at this point in our collective lives, people are feeling ripped off because they're not being sold a full pound of coffee. I don't know that it even enters the consciousness. I don't think it enters the consciousness for most sellers either, because they just think a 12-ounce bag of coffee, that's what we sell, It's not until I see a liter bottle of wine that I realize that other bottles of wine are smaller. And I don't feel ripped off because every bottle of wine isn't a liter or a Magnum. there's just certain things come in different sizes that are sort of standard, culturally or just by custom. I don't know that we're meeting the consumer where they are in terms of what we put on the bag, whether that's information about the bag itself or about the coffee inside of it or about the ways that we do business in this industry. Thinking about the bags that I have had recently and looking specifically to see how do they convey, is this bag compostable or not? Does it tell me what I need to do in order to make it compostable? All these different things, because that has become such a part of the marketing. I am shocked at how few actually go into any kind of detail about, you have to remove the valve, you have to remove the zipper, you have to remove any stickers. Your local municipal compost might not accept it. It may still end up in a landfill. They just say compostable on them. And I have home compost here. What if I put it in my compost? They're actually really bad in your home compost. You can't just put them in your home compost. None of them say that either, that I've experienced. So do you want to write a novella on the side of a bag about the bag itself? I don't know if that's the solution.
Well, and your packaging is also going to, like you say, it's a information about the coffee inside and the story of your brand or how you adorn the bag. It communicates a lot of different things, and that would be great to see more information about the bag itself. And it's probably not the case because there's not as much deep thought that goes into bag selection, or at least the utility of the bag selection outside of the aesthetics. But the information about the coffee and the old the trope about tasting notes, that customers can't relate to, applies in this conversation, because we do give ourselves a lot of space sometimes to describe like farmers and flavors. And things like that. But if we're not keeping the customer in mind that we're serving, then I love what you said, the idealized version of our customers who we're communicating to, which means we're not communicating to anybody.
Except ourselves, each other.
Yeah, signaling, right? So I guess you have to be, give yourself at least the time to say, well, what do we even want to put on this bag? With packaging, it's already gone so many different directions in this conversation. Talking about the practicalities of logistics and the timeframes to materials and quality impact of different aspects of the bag. And now just the philosophical and missional aspects of what's behind your decisions. But that's what it's like to serve in coffee, no matter where you are. And the fact that we're in such an open industry is kind of great, because you can actually get a lot of those questions answered through conversations amongst each other, like we are with you right now. So this has been fun, and I'm sure we could probably dig down in the rabbit hole a lot deeper here. But suffice it to say, I think people should read this article and then give themselves time to do a lot of research. But I'm curious now what you would leave people with in terms of advice for taking the next step to make more, I guess, both conscious and practical decisions for your business around packaging.
I think what I want to say is that it's okay to try to do your best and to feel like you are operating within a set of limitations that are not ideal, that you won't be able to find your exact perfect package, the one that protects the coffee immaculately for several months and then evaporates, into wildflower seeds at the end of it. There's no real way to do it perfectly right. And I think that it's okay to try to do the best you can and to maybe not find yourself able to meet that ideal. I think the important part is to try. I think the important part is to at least put in the amount of thought and work that guarantees that whatever you're doing is a step better than what you would be doing if you hadn't put in the thought. Because anybody can just buy coffee packaging off of a shelf, out of a catalog, without thinking about it at all. And they'll have something that will hold their coffee. But I don't know if that's good enough for our collective good as we go forward.
Yeah, that's great. I appreciate that. You're always full of, I think, wise and deep thoughts about things related to coffee and life. So it's always a pleasure to talk to you on the show. So like I said, I guess people should read this article, but where can they kind of stay in touch with you and your work?
Well, thank you so much, Chris. That's really meaningful. I often go on. I am the walking existential crisis of the coffee industry. And if anyone wants to be in an existential crisis with me over caffeine, they're welcome to. Nice. I can be reached at Meister at justmeister.com. I'm also Just Meister on Instagram. Yeah, and that's where you can keep up with me. I'm still just writing and bopping around. Always happy to chat about coffee.
Well, thank you for doing just that today with us. And again, it was wonderful to talk to you.
Thank you, Chris.
Okay, everyone. Well, I think we probably could have talked a lot more about this subject, to be honest. And maybe that's true about anything that we really dig deep into when it comes to coffee. I think by and large, we are conscientious people in the coffee industry. So when we consider topics like this, I think it's easy for us to go those directions. And we absolutely need to, because it's the kind of work we put in. It's the kind of due diligence and thought exercises that we put in the beginning that determines the success of not just making the right decision about packaging, but how it impacts all the different areas of our business. Everything matters when it comes to what we do with our time and our resources and what we communicate, all the way up and down the value stream. We're all connected. And so thinking about coffee packaging this way, as we've talked about, I think is really necessary. And like Ever mentioned here, when you want to sit down to make this kind of decision in a more conscientious way in your business, starting with some kind of a map or a decision map based on your priorities and your values is a great first step to get the perfect package for your business and for your customers and the coffee that you serve them. So a huge thank you to Ever Meister for joining us on the show again. Always a pleasure to talk to you, Ever. If you want to reach out and talk coffee with Ever, then you can just reach her at meister@justmeister.com. And if you want to contact me with any questions, comments, or feedback about this episode or any other episode of Keys to the Shop, you can do so by emailing chris@keystotheshop.com. And that is going to do it for us today. Huge thank you to everybody for joining myself and Ever today as we talk about coffee packaging. And I do hope that this episode has truly given you keys to the shop.